Gary Hilderbrand is partner with Doug Reed of Reed Hilderbrand. They have produced an astonishing body of built work in a relatively short couple of decades. They've received over 60 regional and national awards, and in 2013 have been named ASLA's Firm of the Year. Reed Hilderbrand's work, among many other things, deals with a set of very productive tensions in the field of landscape today. On the one hand, we could say that landscape has been increasingly concerned with performance, how landscapes work, and much of the field has been particularly interested in a shift away from concerns for appearance and toward a concern for performance. And that performativity is certainly one dimension of Gary and Doug's work. And at the same moment, I think that Reed Hilderbrand occupy a quite unique position to the extent they're interested in the tension, the relationship between performativity below the surface, but which is not necessarily expressed or indexed directly. And that tension between visibility and invisibility that characterizes their work has recently also informed a book that they've published, Visible, Invisible, on their work that I would recommend to you. Gary is a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects and the American Academy in Rome. He's also taught for 2 decades at the Graduate School of Design, where he's professor in practice of landscape architecture. He's written extensively on both historic and contemporary topics. He's one of our time's finest landscape architects. He's also one of the finest human beings I know. Please welcome Gary Hilderbrand.
Thank you, Charles. Very, very kind. Good evening. It's a full house. I love that. I can hear you. I hope you can hear me. So, I should explain my title. Hopefully we're going to talk about things that are local, and hopefully they land somewhere in the sphere of culture. I'm going to talk primarily about our local work, though not exclusively. I'll make some detours. But I'd want to situate the work that we do within a view that says that the medium that we work with is partly natural and partly cultural. It's a simple but crucial distinction. I'm really honored to be lecturing to a Boston audience because it doesn't really happen very often. You lecture elsewhere, and when you lecture elsewhere, the house isn't full of your friends and everybody who's looking to see how you're doing, and that's okay. But I'm honored to be in this lecture series among, I can say, friends, all of them, and people I really admire. And so it's a privilege to speak in this series in the same space as those other landscape architects. Audience, do not miss Cornelia Oberlander. She is really a treasure. I hope that my words tonight are not received as if they are just about me, because I work in a practice of 32 people, which is really a remarkable practice. And so I really hope that what you hear tonight is a reflection of the aims and the ambitions and the hard work of many colleagues. This one in particular, Doug Reed over here to my left and over there to your left, in a very nicely posed shot in the studio taken by another person over at my left, Missy Harvey, whose work you will see tonight just about as much as you will see Reed Hilderbrand's work, because Missy has been photographing our work rather consistently recently. This is who really does the work. And so I hope that what we speak about tonight is an apt reflection of the hard work of this group of people. We benefit, Doug and I benefit from an enormously dedicated community in the office. And I also want to say that the work is collaborative. It's work that is done by this group of people in the office and some people who have gone elsewhere, over the years. But also, it is representative of collaborations with many other firms locally, locally and nationally and a little bit internationally. And I won't be able to credit all of those people tonight, but, and that's not really right. It's not right for us to take all of the credit of these projects, but amen, that's what it is. I also want to thank Charles and Ann Hawley and Joanne Robinson and the Gardner trustees, because they have brought an amplified level of engagement for landscape architecture to a broader public audience in Boston. We like to say, and it's been said now quite a few times from this podium, that landscape architecture enjoys today an ever-expanding voice, a greater demand for its critical participation, and a growing need for creative leadership among its practitioners and its teachers. I think that's right. Indeed, some of the ways of this expanding role carries with it there's a sense of urgency about it, in a sense, and I think that's also right, for tackling the problems of renewal and rescue on an ever-increasing amount of the urbanizing surface of our planet. This is where I come from. That's the Hudson Valley, about 60 miles north of New York City. Wonderful place to grow up. It's a place where I think I found my devotion to trees and to hills and certainly to the river. Had my feet in the river. At the time it was poisonous. It wasn't hard to become an environmentalist growing up in the 60s along the banks of the Hudson River because you could see it, the destruction of it. And fortunately, I grew up in the midst of a group of people who were committed to turning it around, and it has turned around remarkably. It was also close to New York City, and that infused in me a love of the city, which is undying. I moved here in the late 70s. This is where I moved, and I came here to practice, and I really wanted to go to graduate school. And I'm proud to say that I stayed for my field, but really I stayed for love. And that worked out for me. When you work as a landscape architect, you inevitably become an intrepid traveler. Often you need to become an expert on a place that you've only been to a couple of times, and you need to do it quickly. So I've been in Boston now 34 years, and I'm beginning to get to know it. It's not an easy place to know. With great tools and an open mind even, the idea of becoming a native in New England is just not that simple. So back to an amplified voice for landscape architecture. I saw the opportunity to talk to this audience tonight to reflect on how our firm responds to and contributes to a kind of resurgence in the field. Charles spoke about this very beautifully, and I appreciate the words very much. How to make a healthier, cooler, more responsive, more easily navigable, more permeable, more resilient, more captivating, and more spatially beautiful metropolis. To say it another way, and to borrow a phrase from my colleague who's here tonight, Scott Geiger, I'm interested in how we pursue the idea of the landscape architect as a protagonist for the adapting and evolving city, and how we promote the health and beauty in our own region. So, in a sense, then, a reason to talk about local work tonight. I've wanted to see the last few years of our work as a kind of struggle for a national practice, because we've been working nationally for a good long time, to become more rooted in our locality, to become kind of an intrepid regional practice with a wide-eyed lens of a national outlook. Beth Meyer, who's a friend who is a scholar, whom many I think in the room know, and who teaches at Virginia, said to me one time that it might be really good to think about creating a local niche for your practice, because this is something really worth investing in. And while a national outlook is great, locality really matters. And I think she was really right, and I really appreciate the advice. Boston is paradoxical. On the one hand, conservative roots, cautious, lots of limits, some parochialism. On the other hand, great liberal forces and great traditions, and really an unmatched knowledge community. Forces like Mrs. Jack Gardner, President Charles Eliot of the late 19th century at Harvard, Ernest Bowditch, Robert Morris Copeland, people who saw a way of planning and creating a better future for a Boston that was in the wretches of industrialization in the late 19th century. And then for about 2 decades, while he was the last decades of his life, Frederick Law Olmsted also had a great influence here. What's compelling about having a louder voice today, for me, of landscape architecture, is that it's not unlike at all the circumstances that brought landscape architecture forward as a professional practice 130 or 40 years ago. So the terms we use today to describe ascendancy for landscape could be describing the emergence of landscape architecture in the US, and especially in Boston a little over 100 years ago. I love this image because it tells me that in 1899, this city was like going crazy, bonkers. And in truth, becoming a better place to live, but not a great place to live for everybody who was there. But just after the progressive movement. So nascent intellectual and social capital beginning to deal with the problems of increased urban population, huge densities, untold densities, really, labor abuses, detachment from family and from rural culture, people moving to the city to work, disease, typhoid, lots of problems. I'm borrowing from my colleague Anita Berspieta on this, but I think that she was right in making a comment not so long ago that landscape architecture arose in Boston and elsewhere out of the circumstances of the difficulty of getting food to people, getting goods and services to people, trying to recover rivers, despoiled rivers and the littoral edge, the coast, the seacoast, trying to rescue all that stuff. And so this is how the field emerges, and it's not so unlike what we have today, in a sense. So the Parks movement in the 1870s, which precedes Olmsted's work, a lot of people like to give him credit for that, brought answers, some answers anyway, in the form of more light, cleaner air, cleaner water, recreation, relief for workers. So landscape architecture emerges as an academic discourse around the late 1890s and as a synthetic and integrative practice built upon knowledge from other fields. It's not a field which has its own core of knowledge at that point, that's for sure, built on geography and other kinds of practices. I like to think of it in the 19th century, the end of the 19th century, as a kind of epimediology for the city. The surface of the city is being hardened and destroyed in some ways, and landscape architecture emerges as something that could, in fact, repair it, but more than repair it, could produce the forces that would guide urbanization toward a healthier way of living. And we talk about the same thing today. There's just not much question about that for me. So out of that period, look what happened. That's an unbelievable thing. The basin and the Back Bay, still held up as one of the great urban models, right? Harnessing the Charles River, it took several generations. It was completely despoiled until around the 1930s when the Esplanade was built, and then again when it was expanded in the 1950s when Storrow Drive was blasted through there, late 1940s. Just an unbelievable asset for the city of Boston. It turned the backs of the Back Bay into fronts. Things like that. I'm not talking about landscape architecture now, but just one example, maybe in Walter Crease's words, the crowning example of this incredible turn that would happen in Boston in the end of the 19th century, really in the late 70s and early 80s with Trinity Church. And this is so compelling to me. I know it's hard to do this in a lecture, to put a map up there which looks like crayons, but the Olmsted work, close in, and the Olmsted firm's work of reserving the river reservations there, the Charles, the Mystic, the Neponset, and then a chain of spaces, and galvanizing the forces. This took money, it took politics, it took cajoling and persuading. But this is what comes out of that incredible period of time. and even further out, another chain of spaces. The idea there was to reserve some of the character of the surface geology and the geography, and even in some cases the townships, that had formed a 19th century Boston, and that some people said shouldn't go away as we increasingly urbanize. Also during this time, you have the incredible public and private educational institutions that Boston is famous for still. Professional schools at Harvard and MIT, science, geography, the Latin schools, education reform, the Boston Public Library, an unbelievable time of achievement. And this, again, is a set of conditions where landscape architecture begins to play a significant role. I just wanted to mention here that there's a lovely new book called Community by Design by Hope Cushing, Keith Morgan, and Roger Reed, which in particular talks about the Olmsted firm and its offshoots and their influence in keeping the town of Brookline in a place where it could think of itself as the wealthiest village in America and the most picturesque town in the middle of an urbanizing Boston. And really a lovely book, I commend it to you. But again, now another kind of urbanization, this time in the farther reaches, lower densities, but still really incredible things. We're looking at Beacon Street on the left, and on the right from the cover of Hope and Keith's book, an image of Olmsted's home on Warren Street in Brookline. My aim here isn't to draw comparisons between our work and this period, and it is to say that there is a set of circumstances and traditions from which landscape architecture arose, which we should not overlook in the current day in the way we talk about performance in landscape architecture. In some ways, I think the same root causes are at work here. These traditions can provide a platform for a continued aspiration for keeping the biophysical characteristics of our city and our region in the foreground as we renew and revitalize and reshape the world around us. These are cool images, and they just show you that hardened, developing city, a very ambitious city, and a landscape that comes. Now, 10 years ago, around the time that the central artery was being depressed and I was being depressed about the condition of the surface of it, I wrote this little quote. I wanted to put it before you. In Boston Architecture, I was called up and I sent this little thing in by email. And the question was, what do we do about the ghost of Olmsted? And, it was really a debate about how to turn the artery into a landscape. Stephen Coyle in the 1980s, the director of the Boston Redevelopment Authority, had said we should have 10,000 new trees in Boston. And I think we got 600 or 700 in the end. Really insufficient. But so I was probably in a bad mood. I said, well, sorry, there's no ghost of Olmsted, but there is the sad relic of a synthetic landscape infrastructure. It's barely discernible because we have poisoned waterways, broken parkways. Boy, I really didn't know what I was doing here. Listless government authorities. It's like, I think I probably hadn't ever been to the BRA then. I now go there once a week. In fact, I'm missing a vote tonight that's there. Yet there's also the profound lesson. Here's the positive part. The profound lesson in Olmsted's career that deeply held and rigorously pursued convictions about how we could affect urbanization and change could overcome our current culture's tendency toward conservative, regressive building. I just wasn't happy about this. If we believe that landscape can be an expressive force for the democratic city, as Olmsted did, he believed it thoroughly, then we'll stop making things that look like Olmsted's stuff, and we'll stop preserving mere fragments of the work, which is what I was seeing happening in the greater park system. And instead, we'll follow his real motivation, which was reform. Well, got a call from the Globe writer the next day. Alex Beam, he said, "What are you talking about?" Anyway, I'm going to come back to now. I think the pictures improved a lot. So, you know, I had my bad time there. And for a whole host of reasons, I think we're doing better. Quite literally, Olmsted's work in Boston and elsewhere elevates to the category of reform, no doubt about it. The problems were huge, and Olmsted saw the landscape as a medium of urbanization that could improve conditions for the citizens and augur some redefinition of how we saw the city. These were aspirational and optimistic, some would say positivist, in nature. Our problems are different today, but not all that different. Olmsted today, this is always that crazy question, you know, what would Olmsted do? I think he'd probably be working on education, poverty, and public health. Those are the hard problems. In many ways, that's what he did then. He worked on those things. Through the building of a public realm that gave people space and room and access, good drainage, good soil, good transportation, and inspiration and beauty. Isn't that what we should do? So what does it mean to be practicing here? I have a little hubristic slide that shows that we're having a big influence in the region up there. We have one of the United States also. It's much more sparse than this one, which I'm happy about because, you know, the aim has been really to get to grow those red dots here. So it means something to practice here. For all of the things I said in the last 10 minutes, it means something to practice here. Not a birthright at all, but there is a legacy to try to be a part of. So what should we do? What are we doing? Casinos? No. We did the big dig. I think it came out okay. Not enough landscape there yet. We're working on that. Still a single-purpose highway. It just happens to be below grade instead of above grade, and you can't tell where you are when you're driving in it. What should we be doing? We should be doing a revitalized public realm every time we can. The mayor has said he's not going to be around to do it, but we're going to grow 100,000 new trees in Boston sustainably, hopefully sustainably, not put it in the ground and kiss it goodbye in the next year. And really a stronger, more open, and more contemporary public realm is what we need. I want to say that the surface of the city, right, I showed you that hardening of the last 2 centuries, really. The surface, to me, is alive. It's a living surface, and we need to treat it like a skin, like an integument. It's porous, permeable. It's a vehicle that has to produce nutrient exchange if we're going to have a vegetative cover and if we're going to, you know, live a healthy, breathe healthy air. An epidermis for civic life. So our firm's strong little corner, I think, in this, Charles said it rather beautifully, it's focused on the thing we build, and we don't mind that the workings of it aren't all laid out for you, but we do want to be sure that the workings of it are working. That part is essential for us, and we want to do that thoughtfully and carefully and durably. So I'm going to do 2 things now in the remainder of my time. A panorama of our regional work. It's going to be like speed dating Reed Hilderbrand projects in the region, and then some more detail on projects that hopefully embody the themes that I've been discussing. That all starts with this project that Doug Reed did practically single-handedly long before I arrived in his front porch. And it's the Institute for Child and Adolescent Development. It's sadly no longer there, but it's a project that received really worldwide recognition, and deservedly so, and it really is at the very root of our practice. We won a competition together, which was really the basis for forming our firm at the Arnold Arboretum, and I'm going to show you now quite a few Missy Harvey photographs, which make our work seem like it's been there a long time. I always think this looks ancient. And I have to say that Marianne Thompson joined us on this effort, and it was about a 6-year project, really a phenomenal experience for us all. Our work at Mount Auburn Cemetery, our work kind of revising the public horticulture of the Christian Science Plaza, now 10 or 15 years ago. Work at the Spalding Rehabilitation Hospital, a park in the middle of a tough neighborhood in Somerville, and a lot of campus work in the region. Sorry, that's a bit hot green there, but this is the Groton School, one of the Olmsted brothers, Olmsted Senior, rather, landscape from the 1890s, in Olmsted's last decade, where we have been working. I began work there in 1991, and we're still working there today, and we've just had a wonderful relationship there. Our work at MIT, building MIT's newest quadrangle, and a host of other improvements there. The quadrangle looks like that on a winter day. We're working at Harvard Business School. We've been working there now for 5 years, and we have what you see here as a campus, again, an Olmsted Brothers and McKim White project, which is venerable and really widely respected, especially by graduates of Harvard Business School, but not only them. And so today, we call that the Legacy Campus, but that campus has been growing and growing. And so we've now, for a few years, and the work is still too young to photograph. I don't have images of this except for this fairly recent aerial. You can see now the development of their newest building, Tata Hall, which is really quite a change in the way they build at the business school. It's on the edge of the Legacy Campus, but really it's on the river. And so our work, this is with William Rahn Associates, and I think a very good building, has really been to have Harvard and the business school begin to open up this edge of campus as a public realm that overlaps with the realm of the university. And so some of you may know, we tore down a wall here last year and opened up East Drive to public access. We're producing a path that's now well inboard of the boundary, the property boundary, finally a safe place to ride a bike or walk on that edge of campus. And we're doing many, many, many projects throughout here to restore the canopy of the campus back to good health and to grow another generation of trees for the future. We've been doing the master planning for that. And as a result of that, we also have been working very hard with the city and with Harvard on its expansion plans for Alston. We can't show you that now, but hopefully in a few weeks' time, the next BRA board vote, we'll be able to, which is in 2 weeks, we'll be able to bring that work forward. Another local project among many, Doug and Eric Kramer and Jeff Fritz are working at the DeCordova Museum. And just a quick illustration here of what I have always thought of as a very clogged up, I mean, a wonderful place with amazing stuff, but very clogged up. And the proposal, which has now been really embraced by their board and is going into a couple of other phases, working here with Util architects, is really to open this landscape up and really make sense of the logic of arrival and of visitor services and all of that. Moving downtown now, quite a lot of park work in recent years, including, again, with Util, the wonderfully successful Boston Harbor Islands Pavilion in the middle of the Wharf District, part of the Rose Kennedy Greenway. And there's another view of Util's wonderful structure there. And our little splash block, which takes the rainwater and momentarily delays it in a beautiful little tide pool kind of thing, and then delivers all of that water to the trees on the lawn just to the south. We just opened 2 weeks ago, I think maybe you know, 3 weeks ago, I guess, this carousel. We thought, why would we work on a carousel? It turns out that it was a really good thing. Well, we certainly wanted to do it because it was right next to our other project, and so we wanted to be in charge of that. But this, we also envisioned this to be in a grove of trees. The trees have lost their leaves because of their stress, but in very short order, this is going to be, on the French model of a carousel in the grove of trees in the middle of the city They sold 3,000 tickets on the ride on the first day, and I think it seems like it will be a success. We've just finished and opened a little park on the edge of the Fort Point Channel District in the Seaport District. Just a beautiful little corner next to a parking garage, but the beginning of a set of public realm improvements. There's one of the entrances to the park. A set of improvements that is part of our work with Boston Global Investors for all of this 6-block area of Seaport Boulevard and facilities that will build a city now adjacent to Harry Cobb's federal courthouse, the Joseph Mowgli Courthouse. So this is work, again, that has just been in the planning stages for 6 years, and we're now beginning to get in the ground. That was our first little park. This is going to be a hotel beginning construction next month, and another park to come next year in this location adjacent to the Fan Pier Park there. It's been wonderful to work on these projects, really trying to envision, I should say something like this, a lot of this, you can see what Seaport Boulevard looks like here. It's a very wide street, and it's going to stay wide, but we're trying to get all the sidewalks and all the things in the right place. And I sometimes tell people that if you told me when I was a child that I was going to be excited about building sidewalks, I would have said you're crazy. But in fact, we have really come to love getting it right, and it's not an easy thing to do, and keeping it alive. So that's our idea for that. Here's an example. This is Liberty Wharf, which is not part of Seaport Square, but just down the street on Seaport Boulevard. Very quickly, this is a very narrow sidewalk, just conditioned by the fact that that was the property line. This is where Jimmy's Harborside used to be and is now Liberty Wharf. This is the seawall. And the seawall was going to be, they were going to take those top granites off because they were kind of in the way and pave the sidewalk to the pier and then make the pier out of concrete. And that was, I think, the approach that was envisioned. Programmatically, you couldn't beat the idea of 3 thriving restaurants here, looking at the water, the boats, and the planes coming in and so on. It's been a real success. But trying to work hard for months and months to persuade people to get that right. There's a gap here between the seawall and that building, and the pier is made of wood, the way piers ought to be made. The structure is concrete, the surface is wood, the railing is super light, and it's a public way. This is a part of the Boston Harbor Walk, and so you can ride your bike there, and I can have a nice lunch right next to it. We like to get the material conditions really right. So again, I can thank Missy Harvey for finding, the light and the shadow and the moment to convey this to you. It's pretty hard to convey landscapes in photographs, but this is a good example. Just the simplicity of getting these things mainly quiet and right. Okay, now, this isn't quiet, and it isn't right yet. Anyone know where you are? So this is going to change someday. And I know that there have been a history of many people who have had ideas about how to change that. And we just kind of hope that we might succeed where others haven't. What do I want to say here? City Hall Plaza is a tough place. I'm a big defender of the building, and I think it's had a very long period of poor stewardship. And I think it's, there was a Paul McMorrow's piece in the Globe on Monday, I think, said, again, let's tear this down. I don't think that's the right answer. I think let's take care of it, brighten it up, and, make it a place of civic pride. And we can do the same thing to the surface of City Hall Plaza. We were engaged exactly a year ago with Util and Durand, Anastas, and Niche engineers to rethink the surface of the plaza. And we took this attitude, again, that it's an alive surface, but also that the plaza has to be smaller. And so we proposed more than 100 trees in City Hall Plaza. There are ways to do this. It's an incredibly complex place, We said we would take it from having almost no shade to having quite a lot of shade, from being completely impervious to being fairly pervious. Opening up the subway entrances, as is already a project that's underway, and then also dealing with water as it conveyed across the surface, storing it, treating it, and the like. So we think this is a possible way to recuperate City Hall Plaza and make it a place of pride. And we hope, and so that's my message to John Connolly and Marty Walsh. Anybody taking notes? So I think we're doing pretty well in Boston, and we've come a long way even in 10 years. Now a little bit more detail on a few projects. I know that the Clark is well known to this audience, and it's just a remarkable place, and it's in Massachusetts, so we still haven't veered too far off my theme. On the right is a painting by George Innes, which in a certain way captures a romantic view of a landscape. It happens to be in New Jersey. That landscape really exists at the Clark, and the incredible resource of the Clark is that there's this unmatchable collection of mostly romantic 19th century paintings, European and American, fantastic collection, also decorative arts, and now also contemporary works, in a pastoral setting. So you're not going to the MFA to see this, you're actually in the country. And the Clark has been able to take advantage of that for its neighbors, because it was kind of hard to get there unless you do it. But our work over the last 12 years, and this will open next year, has been to unravel this landscape, open it up, make it breathe, and make it accessible, and to make the experience of arriving and getting out of your car and going into the museum as much about the landscape as it is about the approach to the works inside the collections themselves. It's a remarkable landscape, and only 70 years ago it was quite open, and we're all aware of that, but that little figure of meadow today, which is there, was just a part of a very big open landscape. This is a plan that I'm not going to describe, but we have will have by next year picked up and replaced every road, path, every blade of grass at the Clark, and restored their woodlands. Here's a kind of geographic view of this. This is looking south. You're looking at the southern rim of the northern Berkshire Valley. And the Clark is here, and it's 140 acres. And this patch of meadow, which of course used to be pervasive, is now a very revered figure of grassland. It's the highest point in the town, and everyone thinks they own it in the town. It's a kind of commons in a sense. We've been trying to protect that, to make the experience of the Clark reveal it, and make it also connected to the hydrologic systems and also to the regional trail network. So the Clark becomes even more a commons, facilitates this more both for the visiting museum-going public and also for the community of Williamstown and for cultural tourism in the greater Berkshire area. So I won't describe that because I want to go a little bit faster. This is an Ondo view of the visitor center. You will come around and see that great big landscape, those hills to the south, and then you will go through this to a very significant water feature, which we think of as, in next year, Williamstown's largest skating pond. It's a machine, really. This is a diagram I can't explain, but we take account of every drop of water here, and the headline of that is that the Clark's expansion would have meant the use of 6 million gallons of potable water a year. And through the hard work of engineering this landscape, we've reduced that to 3.2 million gallons of water, and we're reusing vast amounts of processed water. The pond is a machine, in fact. So we've built the first phase of this, and we're on our way to the second and third phases now. And these are some of the connective trails. This is what the restoration of the woods looks like. And this is the first phase just after it opened in 2009. Tadao Ando's quite small but lovely building, which has galleries and also the home of the Williamstown Art Conservation Center. And we have a little glimpse there of what's to come in the way of opening up views and bringing this landscape to a kind of a much more inhabitable state. I think Central Wharf is widely known, but I wanted to talk about some of the ideas behind it. This is in downtown Boston, and of course these are both photographs of Eugène Auger, one describing the edge of the quay in Paris as a living environment with trees. A bit of a tough environment for those trees, but it seems like they could take it. And the way of making the surface of the city by hand. I just love that tamping that's going on in that photograph. And we had the idea that we could, it's a small plaza, tiny. It's not much bigger than a little garden in town. That we could make the surface by hand, or recall that kind of handmade surface, granite cobbles, 3 different kinds, and have the trees really just coming out of that. And so there is a kind of, maybe there's a nostalgia to this, but in fact there's also a performance characteristic, which is that we can pick those cobbles up, and we have done several times, to get at the roots of the trees to make sure that they remain healthy, and they have been growing like bandits. It's there in front of the aquarium against the central artery, which of course in this precinct has nearly no trees. And so in a way we were making a statement of quite the opposite character, to take a space and to make its identity come from the trees. That's what it looked like. The idea was, a continuous medium below that surface, which we could go back into if we had to. We also made the site twice as big as its original boundaries by making an agreement with the city to be able to build the plaza on a larger piece of ground. So here was the point of view about this. We were saying that in order to have a spatial world that we like to inhabit, in order to have that image of a living canopy in the city, and in order for that canopy to perform the way people like to talk about it, as taking up pollutants and producing X amount of oxygen, of helping to manage stormwater, of intercepting runoff, of producing shade which cools the surface, all of those things. In order to do that, this is kind of simple, but you really have to build a support network to do it, and we called that life support, and we built it as a kind of demonstration. And so it looks a little bit like this. This will go very fast. So there's the surface. Our client, the Frog Pond Foundation, really wanted a garden here, and I think we would have, now, critical reflection on this, we really would have liked to and proposed that this be a kind of uniform surface. That really wasn't consistent with their program. So these trees have a different kind of setting, but these are trees representing, these are dots representing the trees, are on this surface, and it's slightly pitched so that you get a little bit of a view of the harbor as you approach toward the aquarium. So that's the surface. Below that is a nest of utilities and all sorts of stuff, and the need to sink these skinny little piles to support the granite that would have held up the plaza and its walls. Then there's the continuous medium of soil below all of that. There's the surface again. And this surface has to be able to support the travel of a vehicle, and it has to allow the trees to breathe and so on. There's a drainage system that's barely visible. That you can see in the blue there. That delivers all of the rainfall immediately back to the roots of the trees through a system of lattices like that. They travel this way. There's supplemental irrigation, and we have sensors so that if it's too dry, we can also water it. There are aeration devices, and if this thing floods or if it gets too much inundation from below, we can drain it. And so that's a life support for a group of trees we hope was going to last for generations. And so in a certain way, we've begun to reform the way we think about the surface and what's below the surface so that we can achieve something beautiful above the surface, which looks like that in the daytime. Actually, these trees have grown at least 6 feet since 3 years ago, and it looks like that at night. Going to travel now to Texas. I purchased the photograph on the left a few years ago after a visit to Philip Johnson's glass house in New Canaan. Perhaps some of you have been there. And I was taken with James Welling's photograph here and with the issues of transparency and reflectivity. And I made a series of collages, including the one on the right, that were exhibited in the exhibition that Charles mentioned this summer here at the Gardner. But this was a way for me to have a kind of personal investigation of those issues, which I think are profoundly interesting at the Glass House. There's also a certain, of course, contemporary in the 1950s way of thinking about domesticity. So much is removed, and in fact, until I went there, I didn't really know that there was a house where you could put all the stuff that you don't really want to see. The brick house. Did anybody know about the brick house? You know about the glass house, right? There it is. It's like 50 feet away. It's just funny. These were part of a kind of escapade that Doug and I and John Grove and Naomi Cottrell and others at the office went on this kind of 7-year investigation about how to make that a place to live. So that's Philip Johnson's 1964 Henry Beck house in Dallas, and that's what it looked like when we first went there. And we thought, wow, that's going to not be an easy project at all. Most of them aren't easy, by the way. But so this sits on a creek, and this property spans a creek, and this is really suburban 50s and 60s subdivision development in Preston Hollow, in the north edge of Dallas. And it looked like that. It's like, wow, how to approach that. And sometimes it looks like that. Because of that incredible suburbanization and all of the paving and hard surfaces, streets that are too wide, driveways that are too wide, and drains that are inadequate, essentially a stream is seen as a kind of culvert or a passage to take the floodwaters. And I can tell you that standing on the bridge and looking at that is a scary thing. That we're not correcting that. We can't correct it, though we did have to rebuild the stream edge 3 times until it finally took hold and could survive this kind of inundation. That happens. I was there in a rainstorm, very hard rainstorm, and in 30 minutes, that goes from a trickle to that. And that's just from years of bad practice. Anyway, I think some of you know that Philip Johnson has a little version of that in New Canaan, and this is a lovely photograph by Frank Welch of the house in its 1980s state. And Philip Johnson was investigating that kind of thing. There's Philip Johnson there leaning over a big model of the New York State Theater, which came out of that same kind of precast concrete idea. Lovely, actually, beautifully made, both at the New York State Theater and at the Beck House. The issue of openness and transparency to me was something of real frustration in this plan. This is a really wild house. You already knew that from that first photograph. But you go into this hall, which has this double stair that seems as if it were borrowed from the Four Seasons in New York. And then you have this place to get to where you just can't go any farther, and it seems as if in order to get to the rest of the garden, you have to, like a Jesuit, walk across this very funny stair and this kind of procession. We wanted to break that. Our impulse was to kind of knock this thing off its card table stand. It seemed like a little model of a funny house. And we saw the order of the stream as something more powerful, let's say, than the strictly orthogonal order of the house. So that was an early inspiration to try and go from the order of the pecan orchard and the house, which Johnson obeyed very strictly, to this other order. And these were existing things that had to be removed. But for us to be able to locate and situate our program within a different order than the house. And so here's a diagram that shows that we established that order, of course, here at the honorific place of the pecan orchard, and then broke it here. We broke through the wall with a big set of stairs there, and then began our address of this little valley and carried little concrete risers across and situated the rest of the program on that order. So back inside the house, a fantastically built and restored staircase here with Missy's photograph. And now you would have had this little horizon right here before the work, and there it is. So that was the existing condition. Just a kind of, what I came to think of as a kind of distancing mechanism from the landscape, not something that put you in the landscape, but something that made you gaze at it from a stance. This is a lovelier place along the side, though it was a completely open lawn, and we decided that we would try to knit that canopy back together, and so we placed one great live oak on that plinth, raised the grade around this, and then broke through it with a very intentionally different language of stair, which allowed now the axis to unfold. And we began building these curbs. There are 4,000 running feet of those curbs, and they perform in very different ways. Here they stack up as a set of stairs with grass. There they stack up in a different way. Here as single steps on broad lawn plains. You can see how that then moves down toward the creek and the bridge. And then on the other side, this system really was a device that enabled us to keep many of the existing trees that were not good soldiers on their own, but good collectively as a kind of maturing canopy. So we cleaned out literally hundreds of smaller trees and sizable trees here in order to capture this quality of being under the grove of trees. And these risers allowed us really to make level places, for instance, a place for Tom Friedman's sculpture there, or Oliver Eliasson's piece in there, and then for this pool complex as well. So it looks like that on a winter day from the terrace, and like that on an early summer morning, early July. There's a beautiful little moment of a sneaky way to get through from the front to the family entrance here. This was a kind of dreadful space which we recuperated through a lovely fountain with the help of Dan User from Toronto. And then bringing health back to the pecans, which are now, I think, 70 or 75 years old, and thriving again now because of the good work we did with soils and grading. And so you just have a feeling at this property of being embraced by a great found crop of trees. Nobody planted these trees. These are volunteers, having done all of the work in the canopy to get them to health. And it really has been a lovely outcome. A project now that Doug Reed led and that I also worked on, and that Chris Moyles and Kristen Fredrickson and Bree Mendoza did in downtown Chicago, inside the Loop. This is a tiny project. And I use these images to think a little bit about issues of transparency and reflection. I think we're all drawn to the idea of palimpsest, but we've all seen kind of odd outcomes of that in the 1980s and 90s. But the literal and phenomenal transparency that occurs on a manuscript on thin paper like the one on the left or the same qualities that could be produced in a painting by Paul Klee in 1927 or 28, are, I think, ineffable, long-lasting qualities that are worth seeking in the landscape. And in this case, we have, in the architect John Ronan, a very brilliant solution for the headquarters of the Poetry Foundation. It's a building that is really, truly about transparency and reflection and opening. It opens at the corner where you would land, and it also opens from a distance. And it's like a thing inside of a thing inside of a thing. And isn't that quite like poetry? It's a really wonderfully poetic solution. A thing inside of a thing inside of a thing. That's a diagram of it. And so I think that the pattern that we devised for this court seemed so kind of interestingly compatible with the spaces adjacent to it, which happened to be on the inside of a thin, very thin and very clear glass curtain wall, that John decided that that pattern really should travel right inside. So the idea then is that the courtyard is the poetry headquarters, is the reading room, is the lobby, is the relaxation room at the other end. And so this became a very simple solution which was pervasive on the ground floor, both inside and outside. You can see this now from the second floor. It looks simple, right? But underneath that paving is a pretty complicated set of forces, life support, that will keep those trees going. In fact, Doug and I were there this past spring, and these trees have really grown substantially. And one of our summer interns sent us a photograph, I think in late August, on his little trip to Chicago. And they've done extremely well this summer. So it's very gratifying when you convince patrons and clients of something that costs more than they think it should, which they do not see. I mean, this is a little like taking you into the kitchen, right? But to get you to understand that network under there, it's alive. The skin is alive. Just a couple more projects. It's going to be time to go. We did a boardwalk that's a half a mile long in the Berkshires for a private client. And these images are of neurons, but they are of something that I think of as a dendritic system. And what dendrites are really are a flow mechanism. And what we found and I have to credit Glenn Valentine with this, who worked very closely with us on the project and who really did a very masterful job in the execution of it, really in conceiving and executing it. Look at this pattern of a freshwater wetland, which has, there's resistance, right? There's resistance to flow happening partly by sedimentation, partly by vegetative growth, some of it invasive, and partly by beavers. So that largest impoundment is a pretty active beaver location. We had to examine this very carefully, and it took 9 months of work with the local Conservation Commission to get permission to build the boardwalk. What you see here is a system of cross-country skiing trails and walking trails, and really this is an old road that got cut off by the Mass Turnpike. This is in West Stockbridge. And this is a reservoir, a lovely reservoir, and it outfalls into this, as does a stream system that comes down here. And this is a very slow-moving place, and we thought almost no movement at all. But in fact, having worked with the Conservation Commission, done a habitat study to find there were several perennial streams here, and that those needed to be protected very carefully. Other parts of this could be exploited a little bit. But the idea in the end was, if you're going to find a way to be out there in the middle of that wetland where no one's been, No one's been there. You're going to do that very carefully. And so we ended up with a system of making this by hand. And so there's an image of it from the air, photograph taken in the fall, late fall by Alex McLean. Really a gift to have this photograph of it. A very sinuous line where you can see that we were traveling around very carefully here around certain obstacles, you'll see in a second, and then getting out and really out into a kind of a protected and small bit of open water here, and quite a large piece of open water here where I mentioned that all of those beaver dams over the years had created impoundments. This is how we made this. It's men in waders with electric saws and screwdrivers, and little rods that get screwed into the mud. And then the final thing is, to cut off the end to get that sinuous, cut off the ends of the boards to get a sinuous line. And by the way, when you get to this point, these have all radial cuts. And so there are 5,000 planks on this boardwalk, and probably 20% of them were shimmied by hand in order to make the curvatures. And it looks like that. Now, this almost looks as if it's failed, but it's not. The Conservation Commission was very concerned about daylight in the perennial streams, and so about shading and daylight. So we had to raise this boardwalk about 24 inches over the perennial streams. And, I thought that was going to really ruin it. I thought, no, this thing has to be flat. It really is one of the best characteristics of it. So, sometimes your instincts really aren't the best answer. And so the rise and fall of that on the curves really has turned out to be something really lovely. And this is one of the platforms. We are right now enlarging that platform. The owners who just said, well, this is just such a discovery, have decided that they really want to be able to sit out there. And so we did, after some pretty hard work, again with the Conservation Commission, get permission to enlarge the platforms and to make a seat out there. It just has this kind of mysterious quality of walking on water at times. We didn't know, it was really a delight to understand that we were also creating a wildlife corridor, as they call it. So the property manager set up a camera and got some really interesting revelations. Now, we really just didn't expect that to happen, right? And I really don't want to run into that guy. But okay, I think last project. This is a project on the coast of Connecticut. It's a private home. And the issue that's of interest here is the relationship between extraction, which is to take stone out of the ground in a quarry, and making something, or the refuse, and what you do with the refuse. So you can see this is the old, an old photograph of a quarry in operation, and on the left is an image from a project that I think many of us have known and loved for a long time called Opus 40 in upstate New York, a project by a sculptor, Harvey Feit, who taught sculpture at the New Paltz State University of New York. And a remarkable thing that he made there, which was a beautiful dialogue about the refuse of extraction and an experience that one could have out of making something out of that refuse. So here we are at Old Quarry. So the old Stony Creek, this is one of the veins of Stony Creek Quarry. A lot of stone was taken out of here. In the 1940s, it was essentially mined out, and so it was subdivided. And what you can see in this photograph is that many of the properties have created what is, a kind of unfortunate answer here of kind of big lawns and long vistas to the water. The vistas are good. And that is the site of a house by the sculptor Tony Smith. He built two houses. They're both here, one there and one here. Probably good that he didn't build any other houses. When our client, who is an architect, a couple who are both architects, purchased the property, they had to commit to essentially taking the entire house apart and rebuilding it, which is a colossal feat in itself, rebuilt in a kind of museum quality way. It's really spectacular. And then they built an addition, and you had the problem then of taking a sculptor's work and sitting alongside it with another building. Very, very hard problem. We really took our time on this one. That's a photograph of Missy's, of the quarry, and this is literally just across the street from the house. And this is the site, I think, from Doug's and my first visit. I have to give a lot of credit here to Eric Kramer and Becca Sturgis, who have really labored over this, particularly Becca, now for, I think, 6 or maybe 7 years. But that is what we started with. And all we could think of really was, what do you do with all the rock? You can't take it off site. And can you grow a community of plants here? Could you make a garden here? Yeah, well, we did. In some ways, it was an exercise in irregularity for us. And, you can see that our work tends to be, fairly rectangular, at least a lot of the time. And the idea emerged here of making something that was extremely fluid and curving, and to somehow knit this site back together, not try to erase the history of extraction, not cart any of the rock off, and use as much of the rock as we could in ways that might provoke a meaningful experience for every day for the owners and for their visitors and guests. So one way to think about using the rock was as building jetties, and so we made several walks that were kind of jetty-like. The house, as you can see, is something that sits on very skinny columns or pilotis. There's a base, a core, that's where the mechanical stuff is. This is really right next to the shore. And then we rebuilt this concrete deck underneath it. This is the way you get into the house. And this is, the community of plants that we began with in the recovery of the site. There's a view of that cove, very lovely. And I think Eric had the idea here that the experience of being underneath this house, you'll see something beautiful in a second about that, was not unlike a kind of scroll painting of a landscape, because you had the occlusion of the sky and you had this kind of thin horizon of landscape. And it's especially true back in this direction, when you're looking back toward the driveway. I mean, it's a nice driveway, but it's a driveway. And that experience was also, I think, profoundly increased in its value by Fred, the architect's decision to put glass planking in the deck in places. And so this shadow play is really just kind of spectacular. A community of plants that would survive inundation and pockets of soil. We couldn't build a whole lot of soil here. We had to do it in pockets. We had to use plants that will thrive on thin soil. There's a jetty and a little bit of path crossing that walk. Starting to reorganize. We thought of it as reordering the refuse in a way, keeping it on site and trying to make use of it. And so you're looking now down from the addition, where there's a little deck looking into a pit, which in fact fills with water at high tide and has an indication of occupation, but is in some ways left, well, in places is left completely as we found it. And then the space in between the buildings, which is where I'm standing now, we did what we call the fish scales, which was a way of producing a soil environment with the rock that we could get at. We could go back in, and so in which we have had to do so, to go back in and repair the root areas of these trees after inundation. And so just some very quiet and poetic ways of thinking about rock that we found here and reordered for experience. And there's a view of the hawthorns that we populated at the edge of the meadow. Okay, I'm going to conclude now. So I've talked a bit about the city and quite a bit about the country and also about the substrate in between. What I think binds the city and the country is the land, the biophysical, the physiographic, the biotic, the ecological, and the human. And I think through our work we've tried to establish, among all the things that we need to do, an ethic of stewardship on every site, whether it's in town, downtown, or in the country. And that's something that has always been rooted in the rural in the United States. But we think it applies equally to the landscape of the city. Telescoping scales, every scale of work and every kind of resilient relationship, urban, suburban, and rural. The surface is alive. Back to my earlier point about moving here and being intrepid, there are no natives. We are all adapted, cultivated, and evolving. Thank you.
Do you want to manage questions or Sheridan?
We went a little long there, but I'm happy to take a couple of questions, if there are any. Thank you for such a long span of attention. So there's a mic if you don't mind.
Could you talk a little bit about how you keep the trees alive, the infrastructure underneath them?
Yeah. So at the Central Wharf, which is our sort of landmark experience with that, I have to say that we had a client in the Frog Pond Foundation that really went the distance. The idea for us to be super sure about what it would take to grow trees for generations was something that we couldn't come up with that ourselves, and we had to use several scientists, soil scientists, a biologist, design the soils. Here's something about that work. And I should say we don't go anywhere without soil scientists anymore. It's probably, among all the things in our careers, the thing that has changed the most is that we just don't haul soil off a farm and drop it in anymore. It's proven that, trees in a dense urban area last on average 7 years if that's the approach. So if that's the approach that is being asked, we just don't do it. So building the soil is something that all the soil is designed, tested, delivered, tested. And then we have monitoring systems in there. So I know you're getting the impression that this is a costly thing, right? This is really the way we have to do it, and we have to evolve economies in it, and we are. And I can say that, in our work with fantastic couple of landscape architect, scientists, chemists, John Swallow and Bob Pine, we've probably done this a little differently each time because we learn from each experience. And, we're trying to prevent anaerobic conditions. We're trying to make sure that moisture travels through but doesn't stay. There are just many things about the science of providing an environment for nutrient exchange. It's complicated, and in the end, it's the way we will have a larger, more significant urban canopy. And it really is the only way. Would you mind taking the mic? Thanks.
On the quarry project, did you cut the stone or did you just use pieces as they were found?
Yeah, we cut stone. Yeah. Mostly found, some cut. There's a question on the first balcony.
I think I can speak loudly now.
You can.
On the stone, it was the same question I was leaning towards. What was the relationship with your staff, or with the masons that you had to do that? Did you give them drawings? Did you
Yeah.
stand around and talk? How'd that go?
We draw everything, and we draw it again and again and again. That's a very intense activity in our practice. But we also do things on site. And so we had time on site regularly, at least weekly, sometimes a couple of days a week with the masons. It's a relationship like that that will produce something of beauty. And it's never easy to make a beautiful thing, no matter what the field is. We had, you may enjoy this comment too. At Old Quarry, we had to get the masons to not do their usual thing that they do with us, which is like try to perfect it. Because we didn't want a perfect condition there. We wanted something that looked like it had been assembled, but not overly rigid and not so artificial. So in every case, it's working very closely with people on site, and we try to devote about 25 or 30% of our services to the period of construction on a project like that. One more. Here's one.
After you're done, how do you sustain your projects? The maintaining of the project?
And in the very best examples, and I could say that the Beck House in Dallas is maybe one of the great examples of this. Doug has been working on another property in Long Island for now 17 years. We have annual visits with the client at Beck House. And we're perhaps there even more than annually because we have other work in Texas, and so we can get by somewhat frequently. So I think the paradigm for us would be that we don't go away, that we continue to evolve a project. I mean, everything adapts. You know, no landscape is complete when you sign the paper that it's substantially complete or the project is closed out. In fact, the landscape is just beginning. And so it takes work for years sometimes, and constant work to have plants, especially plants, but not only the plants, the hydrological systems also, to adapt to new conditions. I mean, you think about when we planted those trees at the Central Wharf, those trees were 12 inches in caliper when we planted them. What happened to those trees is, 2 years in a nursery in New Jersey with careful root pruning to be sure that the root production was going to be captured when we moved the trees, planted those trees, and that's a complete shock. It's an entirely alien environment for that tree. And this is one of the reasons why, back to the earlier question, it's so crucial to have an environment where those trees can, while they're overcoming the stress of root cutting and transplanting and transporting and being moved around on a crane with wires, overcoming the stresses from all that and trying to produce roots. And usually when trees are planted like that, they're susceptible to, injury and pests and so on. So it's a very tricky business. I think it's very underestimated how serious a business it is to plant trees in the city and expect them to live for a really long time. So we should wrap up. Okay, I'm going to thank you again for being here tonight.